Chapter 5 of The Country Beyond. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Moline. The Country Beyond by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 5. It was in the third week after his hurt that Peter saw Nada. By that time he could easily follow Jolly Roger as far as the fording place, and there he would wait, sometimes hours at a stretch, while his comrade and master went over to Cragg's Ridge. But frequently Jolly Roger would not cross, but remained with Peter, and would lie on his back at the edge of the grassy knoll they had found, reading one of the little old-fashioned red books which Peter knew were very precious to him. Often he wondered what was between the faded red covers that was so interesting, and if he could have read he would have seen such titles as Margaret of Anjou, History of Napoleon, History of Peter the Great, Caesar, Columbus the Discoverer, and so on through the 20 volumes which Jolly Roger had taken from a wilderness mail 2 years before, and which he now prized next to his life. This afternoon, as they lay in the sleepy quiet of June, Jolly Roger answered the questioning inquisitiveness in Peter's face and eyes. "You see, Pied-Bot, it was this way," he said, beginning a little apologetically. "I was dying for something to read, and I figured there'd be something in the mail, newspapers, you know. So I stopped it, and tied up the driver, and found these. And I swear I didn't take anything else, that time. There's 20 of them, and they weigh 9 pounds, and in the last 2 years I've toted them 5,000 miles. I wouldn't trade them for my weight in gold, and I'm pretty heavy. I named you after one of them, Peter. I pretty near called you Christopher Columbus. And some day we've got to take these books to the man they were going to, Peter. I've promised myself that. It seems sort of like stealing the soul out of someone. I just borrowed them, that's all. And I've kept the address of the owner, away up on the edge of the barrens. Some day we're going to make a special trip to take the books home." Peter, all at once, had become interested in something else, and following the direction of his pointed nose, Jolly Roger saw Nada standing quietly on the opposite side of the stream, looking at them. In a moment Peter knew her, and he was trembling in every muscle when Jolly Roger caught him up under his arm and with a happy laugh plunged through the creek with him. For a good 5 minutes after that Jolly Roger stood aside, watching Peter and Nada, and there was a glisten of dampness in the eyes when he saw the wet on Nada's cheeks, and the whimpering joy of Peter as he caressed her face and hands. 3 weeks had been a long time to Peter, but he could see no difference in the little mistress he worshipped. There were still the radiant curls to hide his nose in, the gentle hands, the sweet voice, the warm thrill of her body as she hugged him in her arms. He did not know that she had new shoes and a new dress, and that some of the color had gone from her red lips, and that her cheeks were paler, and that she could no longer hide the old haunted look in her eyes. But Jolly Roger saw the look and the growing pallor, and had noted them for 2 weeks past. And later that afternoon, when Nada returned to Cragg's Ridge, and he recrossed the stream with Peter, there was a hard and terrible look in his eyes which Peter had caught there more and more frequently of late. And that evening, in the twilight of their cabin, Jolly Roger said, "It's coming soon, Peter. I'm expecting it. Something is happening which she won't tell us about. She is afraid for me. I know it. But I'm going to find out, soon. And then, Pied-Bot, I think we'll probably kill Jed Hawkins, and hit for the north." The gloom of foreboding that was in Jolly Roger's voice and words seemed to settle over the cabin for many days after that, and more than ever Peter sensed the thrill and warning of that mysterious something which was impending. He was developing swiftly, in flesh and bone and instinct, and there began to possess him now the beginning of that subtle caution and shrewdness which were to mean so much to him later on. An instinct greater than reason, if it was not reason itself, told him that his master was constantly watching for something which did not come. And that same instinct, or reason, impinged upon him the fact that it was a thing to be guarded against. He did not go blindly into the mystery of things now. He circumvented them, and came up from behind. Craft and cunning replaced mere curiosity and puppyish egoism. He was quick to learn, and Jolly Roger's word became his law, so that only once or twice he was told a thing, and it became a part of his understanding. While the keen, shrewd brain of his Airedale father developed inside Peter's head, the flesh and blood development of his big, gentle, soft-footed Mackenzie hound mother kept pace in his body. His legs and feet began to lose their grotesqueness. Flesh began to cover the knots in his tail. His head, bristling fiercely with wiry whiskers, seemed to pause for a space to give his lanky body a chance to catch up with it. And in spite of his big feet, so clumsy that a few weeks ago they had stumbled over everything in his way, he could now travel without making a sound. So it came to pass, after a time, that when Peter heard footsteps approaching the cabin, he made no effort to reveal himself until he knew it was Jolly Roger who was coming. And this was strangely in spite of the fact that in the 5 weeks since Nada had brought him from Cragg's Ridge, no one but Jolly Roger and Nada had set foot within sight of the shack. It was an inborn caution, growing stronger in him each day. There came one early evening when Peter made a discovery. He had returned with Jolly Roger from a fishing trip farther down the creek, and scarcely had he set nose to the little clearing about the cabin when he caught the presence of a strange scent. He investigated it swiftly, and found it all about the cabin, and very strong close up against the cabin door. There were no doubts in Peter's mind. A man had been there, and this man had gone around and around the cabin, and had opened the door, and had even gone inside, for Peter found the scent of him on the floor. He tried, in a way, to tell Jolly Roger. He bristled and whined and looked searchingly into the darkening edge of the forest. Jolly Roger quested him for a few moments, and when he failed to find marks in the ground he began cleaning a fish for supper, and said, "Probably a wolverine, Pied-Bot. The rascal came to see what he could find while we were away." But Peter was not satisfied. He was restless all that night. Sounds which had been familiar now held a new significance for him. The next day he was filled with a quiet but brooding expectancy. He resented the intrusion of the strange footprints. It was, in his process of instinctive reasoning, an encroachment upon the property rights of his master, and he was, true to the law of his species, the guardian of those rights. The 4th evening after the stranger's visit to the cabin, Jolly Roger was later than usual in returning from Cragg's Ridge. Peter had been on a hunting adventure of his own, and came to the cabin at sunset. But he never came out of cover now without standing quietly for a few moments, getting the wind, and listening. And tonight, poking his head between some balsams 20 yards from the shack, he was treated to a sudden thrill. The cabin door was open, and standing close to this door, looking quietly and cautiously about, stood a stranger. He was not like Jed Hawkins, was Peter's first impression. He was tall, with a wide-brimmed hat, and wore boots with striped trousers tucked into them, and on his coat were bits of metal which caught the last gleams of the sun. Peter knew nothing of the Royal Northwest Mounted Police, but he sensed danger, and he remained very quiet, without moving a muscle of his head or body, while the stranger looked about, with a hand on his unbuttoned pistol holster. Not until he entered the cabin and closed the door after him did Peter move back into the deeper gloom of the forest. And then, silent as a fox, he skulked through cover to the foot trail and down the trail to the ford across which Jolly Roger would come from Cragg's Ridge. There was still half an hour of daylight when Jolly Roger arrived. Peter did not, as usual, run to the edge of the bank to meet him. He remained sitting stolidly on his haunches, with his ears flattened, and in his whole attitude no sign of gladness at his master's coming. With every instinct of caution developed to the highest degree within him, Jolly Roger was lightning quick to observe the significance of small things. He spoke to Peter, caressed him with his hand, and moved on along the foot trail toward the cabin. Peter fell in behind him moodily, and after a few moments stopped and squatted on his haunches again. Jolly Roger was puzzled. "What is it, Peter?" he asked. "Are you afraid of that wolverine?" Peter whined softly, but even as he whined his ears were flat, and his eyes filled with a red light as they glared down the trail beyond the outlaw. Jolly Roger turned and went on until he disappeared around a twist in the path. There he stopped and peered back. Peter was not following him, but still sat where he had left him. A quicker breath came to Jolly Roger's lips, and he went back to Peter. For fully a minute he stood beside him, watching and listening, and not once did the reddish glare in Peter's eyes leave the direction of the cabin. Jolly Roger's eyes had grown very bright, and suddenly he dropped on his knees beside Peter and spoke softly, close up to his flattened ear. "You say it isn't a wolverine, Peter? Is that what you're trying to tell me?" Peter's teeth clicked, and he whimpered, never taking his eyes from ahead. There was a cold light in Jolly Roger's eyes as he rose to his feet, and he turned swiftly and quietly into the edge of the forest, and in the gloom that was gathering there his hand carried the big automatic. Peter followed him now, and Jolly Roger swung in a wide circle so that they came up on that forest side of the cabin where there was no window. And here Jolly Roger knelt down beside Peter again and whispered to him, "You stay here, Pied-Bot. Understand? You stay here." He pressed him down gently with his hand so that Peter understood. Then, slinking low and swift as a cat, Jolly Roger ran to the end of the cabin where there was no window. With his head close to the ground, he peered out cautiously at the door. It was closed. Then he looked at the windows. To the west the curtains were up, as he had left them, and to the east a whimsical smile played at the corners of his mouth. Those curtains he had kept tightly drawn. One of them was down now, but the other was raised 2 inches, so that one hidden within the cabin could watch the approach from the trail. He drew back, and under his breath he chuckled. He recognized the sheer nerve of the thing, the clever handiwork of it. Someone was inside the cabin, and he was ready to stake his life. It was Cassidy, the Irish bloodhound of M Division. If anyone ferreted him out, way down here in the edge of civilization, he had gambled with himself that it would be Cassidy. And Cassidy had come. Cassidy, who had hung like a wolf to his trails for 3 years, who had chased him across the Barren Lands, who had followed him up the Mackenzie and back again, who had fought with him, and starved with him, and froze with him, yet had never brought him to prison. Deep down in his heart Jolly Roger loved Cassidy. They had played, and were still playing, a thrilling game, and to win that game had become the life's ambition of each. And now Cassidy was in there, confident that at last he had his man, and waiting for him to step into the trap. To Jolly Roger, in the face of its possible tragedy, there was a deep-seated humor in the situation. 3 times in the last year and a half had he turned the tables on Cassidy, leaving him floundering in the cleverly woven webs which the man-hunter had placed for his victim. This was the 4th time, and Cassidy would be tremendously upset. Praying that Peter would remain quiet, Jolly Roger took off his shoes. After that he made no more sound than a ferret as he crept to the door. An inch at a time he raised himself, until he was standing up, with his ear half an inch from the crack that ran lengthwise of the frame. Holding his breath, he listened. For an interminable time, it seemed to him, there was no sound from within. He guessed what Cassidy was doing, peering through that slit of window under the curtain. But he was not absolutely sure, and he knew the necessity of making no error, with Cassidy in there, gripping the butt of his gun. Suddenly he heard a movement. A man's steps, subdued and yet distinct, were moving from the window toward the door. Halfway they paused, and turned to one of the windows looking westward. But it was evident the watcher was not expecting his game from that direction, for after a moment's silence he returned to the window through which he could see the trail. This time Jolly Roger was sure. Cassidy was again peering through the window, with his back toward him, and every muscle in the forest rover's body gathered for instant action. In another moment he had flung open the door, and the watcher at the window whirled about to find himself looking straight into the muzzle of Jolly Roger's gun. For several minutes after that last swift movement of Jolly Roger's, Peter lay where his master had left him, his eyes fairly popping from his head in his eagerness to see what was happening. He heard voices, and then the wild thrill of Jolly Roger's laughter, and restraining himself no longer, he trotted cautiously to the open door of the cabin. In a chair sat the stranger with the broad-rimmed hat and high boots, with his hands securely tied behind him. And Jolly Roger was hustling about, filling a shoulder pack in the last light of the day. "Cassidy, I ought to kill you," Jolly Roger was saying as he worked, an exultant chuckle in his voice. "You don't give me any peace. No matter where I go, you're sure to come, and I can't remember that I ever invited you. I ought to put you out of the way, and plant flowers over you, now that I've got the chance. But I'm too chicken-hearted. Besides, I like you. By the time you get tired of chasing me, you should be a pretty good man-hunter. But just now you lack finesse, Cassidy. You lack finesse." And Jolly Roger's chuckle broke into another laugh. Cassidy heaved out a grunt. "It's luck, just damned luck," he growled. "If it is, I hope it keeps up," said Jolly Roger. "Now, look here, Cassidy, let's make a man's bet of it. If you don't get me next time, if you fail, and I turn the trick on you once more, will you quit?" Cassidy's eyes gleamed in the thickening dusk. "If I don't get you next time, I'll hand in my resignation." The laughter went out of Jolly Roger's voice. "I believe you, Cassidy. You've played square, always. And now if I free your hands, will you swear to give me a 2-hour start before you leave this cabin?" "I'll give you the start," said Cassidy. His lean face was growing indistinct in the gloom. Jolly Roger came up behind him. There was a slash of a knife. Then he picked up his shoulder pack. At the door he paused. "Look at your watch when I'm gone, Cassidy, and be sure you make it a full 2 hours." "I'll make it 2 hours and 5 minutes," said Cassidy. "Hittin' north, are you, Jolly Roger?" I'm hittin' bushward, replied the outlaw. I'm going where it's plenty thick and hard to travel, Cassidy. Goodbye. He was gone. He hit straight north, making noise as he went, but once in the timber he swung southward and plunged through the creek with Peter under his arm. Not until they had traveled a good half-mile over the plain did Jolly Roger speak. Then he said, speaking directly at Peter, "Cassidy thinks I'll sure hit for the north country again, Pied Bot, but we're foolin' him. I've sort of planned on something like this happening, and right now we're hittin' for the tail end of Cragg's Ridge where there's a mess of rock that the devil himself can hardly get into. We've got to do it, boy. We can't leave the girl just now. We can't leave her." Jolly Roger's voice choked. Then he paused for a moment, and bent over to put his hand on Peter. "If it hadn't been for you, Peter, Cassidy would have got me, for sure. And I'm wonderin', Peter, I'm wonderin', why did God forget to give a dog speech?" Peter whined in answer, and through the darkness of the night they went on together. End of chapter 5. Recording by Roger Moline.